What is the black box problem? Why is deep learning a black box? It's because all we have is the weights, but I
Mhm.
have no visibility in why those weights are set up that way. In our case, with the weightless neural system, because it's like a state machine, there's a lookup table for that state machine. Any output can be traced back to that lookup table.
Artificial intelligence is a catch-all term for anything that simulates some aspect of intelligence, from the simplest non-playing characters in video game to ChatGPT to a future superintelligence. Machine learning, or ML, is the subset of AI that has been getting all of the attention lately because of its incredible effectiveness in tasks ranging from beating the top chess and Go players, to generating original works of art, to writing college-level essays. But ML is not the only AI in town. Ali Al-Ebrahim, today's guest on Guardians of Alignment, has been working to revive an old technique called weightless neural networks, which he argues are fundamentally more transparent, less prone to hallucination, also known as lying, and more customizable than neural networks trained by machine learning. Ali is personally not concerned about the long-term existential risks of AI that I typically focus on with this channel. The more immediate-term issues he raises, however, are absolutely valid and worth addressing, both for their own sake and to put us on a more stable foundation to address future concerns if and when they arise.
Hi, my name is Ali. I'm an AI researcher and developer from Kuwait. I'm living in Berkeley, California. I've been living here for the past 3 years, working on an AI research project that now, we've begun to be more public with our code, and we've been working with a few developers.
I understand your organization is called AO Labs. Could you tell me a little the story of how that formed?
Yeah. So AO Labs, we incorporated just recently, but really it's based on the research that's been going on for a while. So AO Labs as an organization, I would describe it as a research venture, right? We're both a technology startup, but we're actually based on our own research. It's been a long time coming.
So, yeah, what got you initially interested in AI?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of was like a little geek, like many of us, I imagine. There's a bunch of AI stories and things in sci-fi, and it was all very exciting. And I was definitely all in that world. But professionally, I did my undergraduate at NYU in 2010 to 2015. It was around 2011, 2012 when ImageNet and AlexNet first were beat. So I kind of got to see a little bit of that action while I was an undergraduate. I didn't really understand it completely back then in terms of what was going on, but I got to see some of the researchers like Jan LeCun and Gary Marcus through campus, and they weren't as famous back then. They weren't their ideas weren't developed. It was what was it 6 years later in 2018 that Jan LeCun won the Turing Award for his work on deep learning, right? So I kind of got to see a little bit of that. I remember I met some of their graduate students who were trying to do research. I met some graduate students who had worked on startups at the NYU incubators too, like Matthew Zeller from Clarify, and his company is actually still going strong. They have a really like interesting approach for object detection. So it was in that backdrop where I just didn't get on the deep learning train. So I was interested in it at that time, but something about my experience with it just like made me critical of neural networks as they were. So I started actually looking at alternative techniques.
What was it that said, like, maybe there's something more here?
So back then it wasn't even called deep learning yet, right? So it was like it was more of like just I was critical of neural networks as an end-to-end solution. It was something about context really. Like I would look at the experiment. The thought I had in my mind was you have a human child who gets burnt by a hot stove, and then instantly they self-learn to never do that behavior again. Depending on their level of organism, they might learn that as a word, or they might just learn that in their body as a reaction, depending on how old they are. Maybe their mom is there shouting at the same time fire or hot when they touch that hot stove, and that child would have learned hot in a different way than a different child. That thought was just didn't fit into neural networks as I was exposed to them at NYU. Right? It didn't fit into neural networks. So I was like, there's something missing. It's cool, but I didn't get into it professionally myself. I kind of just did my own thing, but went down that rabbit hole.
The issue that you're seeing here is that when humans learn things, like a single important experience can be enough to shape behavior for a long time ahead, like touching a hot stove. Like, oh, I immediately know not to do that again. But something we kind of seem to see a lot in neural networks is it takes like a lot of repeated experience to gradually shape outcomes. And so that kind of learning just doesn't seem to fit within that paradigm.
It's also a bit, it's also like this is maybe how it relates to alignment in some sense, because you can have this algorithm that you've trained on thousands of labeled photos to detect dogs, but you'll never suggest that it understands dogs, right? How can you
Hmm.
trust that it would understand dogs the way a child learns to understand his way around the kitchen?
Or just like what it means to understand is very different, because like one core idea that I see in neural networks, or one of their big strengths, is this idea of feature abstraction, feature extraction, where it kind of builds up, hey, these are lines, these are basic shapes, this is like a face or symmetry, or that sort of thing, is like seems to be what's happening in neural networks, although interpretability still keeps them very uncertain as to what's actually happening.
Like we
But
hope that's what's going on in the weights, right?
right.
There are just too many of them now that we can't even verify that.
Yeah, but it seems to be extracting something that it generalizes from, and projects out. But one, we don't have a clear control over what that is. But also, like, it seems from your answer that there's something more to understanding than just noticing patterns and extracting from them.
There is a big difference between knowing something and understanding something.
Hmm.
I can know all about mountains and whatever, but obviously it's very different when you climb a mountain or understand a mountain from that perspective. That's maybe getting lost in the words, because what the hell are we talking about? How does this map to AI and whatever? But I mean, in my research, I kind of like went from that baby thought experiment
Hmm.
um, to thinking about how animals learn and how animals understand. Like
Hmm.
when you have a dog and you're teaching your dog to fetch a ball or to sit or
Hmm.
to detect drugs, whatever it is, we can make a distinction between your objective as the trainer, which is for
Hmm.
that task, versus the dog's objective, which in
Hmm.
either case is their reward. But then when you look at it, like, okay, so the dog is like when I say sit to my dog, they don't have this notion of a ideal sit or what the word sit means or anything like that. To them, it means some form of reward, some form of treats that they've learned to just associate. If I had paired
Mm.
treats with something else, they would. But their understanding is their own in that way, and I can trust it. I can relate to my dog's understanding of sit, and I can manipulate that, and I can trust its understanding of sit, or I can trust its behaviors as well as I've trained it.
A key word I'm hearing you use is associate. That like you're making associations between experiences and outcomes, and they're things that are very explicit in terms of what created the association.
Association is an interesting word, right? You could have also said mapping, right?
Hmm.
Really, most of the algorithms we have today, like GPT as a hyperparameterized model, has learned a very complicated mappings between input and output.
Hmm.
You give it this token, it'll give you this token as output.
Hmm.
I'd say that's a mapping. Yes, association is different because association implies you got the input, you got the output, but what's the association there? There has to be like a self to make that association. It's associated with respect to something.
Hmm.
Um, I mean that's there. So at AO Labs, like we're really trying to build smaller networks of AI that can learn to self-associate in ways that we can relate to, right? In ways that we can understand kind of like how that association maps to that agent.
Well, I
I
think that
think that's possible in code. I mean, that we have something working in that level, I think, but it's a bit of a deeper dive.
one thing I'd be interested in hearing about is just your kind of high level understanding of like the some of the history of AI, since you said you saw some things like fairly early on. At what point in that history where your approach starts to diverge from what's maybe a little more mainstream?
Young ones, if you're all freaked out about AI and whatever, you can go to Wikipedia and look up AI winter, and there's been two of them. And AI winters are like tech bubbles gone horribly wrong, where the whole world collapses because we all lied to ourselves in a really stupid way.
Mhm.
That's happened twice in AI. It's worse than like crypto bubbles. It's worse than metaverse bubbles. It's that's why there's a Wikipedia page on it.
Mhm.
So okay, we had the AI winter, the last AI winter, which was from like the 1980s up until 2010-ish, right? That was
Mhm.
the last AI winter. We kind of started to get out of that winter in the beginning when AlexNet, ImageNet, when those things hit in early 2010s. And then it's been up since then on the deep learning branch, right? That's the only branch that took off. So you had all these other branches that kind of died or were forgotten about in the winters past. The one that's managed to survive from the 80s, thanks to Geoffrey Hinton and Jan LeCun and even Yoshua Bengio, was deep learning or backpropagation, right? Gradient descent. They all kind of like build into deep learning.
And one of those branches that died off, that's what you're interested in pursuing, if I'm correct. What is one of those other branches, and why did it die off?
Right. So to do the work I'm suggesting at AO Labs, we had to look before backpropagation, or we had to look like go back in the history and kind of climb off the backpropagation branch onto another branch. I traced the lineage of our research back to the 1980s at Imperial College. There was this researcher in the electrical engineering department called Professor Igor Alexander. He's still around as a professor emeritus there, but he worked on a very interesting type of network, an adaptation of neural networks that's called weightless neural networks. Weightless because you're not learning weight through backpropagation. It's a different mechanism. There were many other techniques from that age that kind of were forgotten about, including this one. It's just kind of interest phased out. There's still a few people working on weightless neural networks, but the focus has been on deep learning and the techniques that drive it, right?
I'd like to hear a little
So
bit more about weightless neural networks. You can give just a brief description. What are those? How is a neuron weightless?
if you consider the paradigm that we're in now, the deep learning paradigm, we talk about models that learn mappings. And these models are really parametric functions. It's like a really long function. The
Mhm.
weights are the coefficients to that function, right? And you have the right weights through all that training to map input to output in this GPT way or in this X way.
Quick pause just for the audience catching things up here. One intuitive understanding that I have of how modern neural networks work is you can imagine like a bunch of neurons. Each neuron takes in a bunch of inputs that are like continuous numbers, so floating points, have decimals, and possibly between -1 and +1. Each of those inputs gets multiplied by a weight. Again, it's just a number, probably between -1 and +1. You could use different ranges. Then you add all those results together. You have a new number. Then you apply a bias. Again, that's just adding a number. And then you apply some kind of smoothing function at the end, makes the result a little bit better. There gets to be a lot of complicated math when you like squish what's happening in a bunch of neurons together, but you can imagine it as just like this individual process repeated over and over. And the end effect of it is each neuron is kind of like a analog or continuous logic gate that can be any gate, have any number of inputs, is very open-ended in that sort of way. Yeah, with that in mind, yeah, what's different about a weightless neuron?
So a weightless neuron is set up like a state machine, right? You have a state machine that is moving from state to state that is made up of smaller neurons. Each one of them can be 0 or 1.
Mhm.
And those smaller neurons, to decide how to make up the total state, they look up a table of experiences of that agent. It's a very different architecture, really. So that's why I was like, your explanation was on point, and actually like adding it to the logic gate level is very eloquent. If I was just simplifying this in my own mind, it's like instead of an equation, you have a state diagram you're moving from, and a list of instructions to move from that state instead of just an equation, right? So that's what weightless neural networks are in a nutshell. It's a question of how you apply them now, right? I
Right.
think we've applied them in a very unique way at trying to go over the arguments I mentioned earlier from the baby, then looking at animals and
Mhm.
upwards. But yeah, weightless neural networks is what powers this approach.
If I understand right, weightless neurons are input and output binary.
Yes,
Uh,
so weightless neurons, they're going to be either 0 or 1, and that 0 or 1, you're not getting there through a previous layer that had weights and all that. You're getting there from that neuron doing a lookup operation, from that agent's memory.
Okay,
Right?
yes. So very lookup based and state machine kind of feel.
Exactly. Exactly.
What is the implication of that? Switching from an analog to a digital kind of setup.
Yeah. So implications are massive, in my opinion. You consider that what is the black box problem? Why is deep learning a black box? It's because all we have is the weights. So effectively, if an equation gives you an output, like if I had y equals mx plus b and it gives me an output,
Hmm.
the best I can do is trace it back to the coefficients, to the weights. But
Hmm.
I have no visibility in why those weights are set up that way, right? In our case, with the weightless neural system, because it's like a state machine, that there's a lookup table for that state machine. That lookup table is comprised of the agent's experience, positive and negative experiences. So the agent, any output can be traced back to that lookup table, to the particular rows in the lookup table which this input mapped to. As opposed to, if you took this lookup table and you squished it into a one-dimensional array, you'd effectively have a bunch of weights, right?
Hmm.
So it's just a mathematical abstraction above the current one that gives that visibility. That there's obviously there's draw downsides and everything, right? One of
Sure.
the downsides is how do you design, what shape does this state machine have, right? Usually you try to make I mean, that's why GPT is now ridiculous, like 250 billion parameters or whatever.
Hmm.
They're just trying to make the equation bigger and bigger and bigger to try to map to more of reality.
Right.
But this way you have to be a bit more thoughtful to get this level of interpretability, which I think says something. You have to kind of like, how many neurons, weightless neurons, do I need to represent my input, output, and reward for this state machine
All
for it
right.
to get to work in a working loop that can be, yeah.
And this inherent interpretability of the weightless neurons, and this isn't obviously isn't because ones and zeros are more interpretable than continuous numbers. It's because they represent state machines and clear associations that you would be able to read. Oh, it learned this from this experience. Is that right?
We have the lookup table of those experiences. We have
Mm.
we have we have the states. We save all of the painful and pleasurable states that the agent encounters. A painful or pleasurable state can be labels. When we give it labels, or it can have a self-labeling mechanism akin to instincts or other things. But regardless, we can then trace back any output to those rows that were saved that the state machine is using as a lookup table.
So in contrast, like a traditional weighted neuron, you can kind of think of it in terms of trust. Like each weight is I'm gonna do what that previous neuron did, or take that information and pass it along in a positive sense. I'm gonna totally ignore it in the sense of zero, or I'm gonna do the opposite, like invert this input if it's a negative number. And that's learned gradually through back propagation, where each weight kind of moves a little bit in a direction that is helpful. But when you see the end result, like that's an end result of many, many iterations, and you don't really know which experiences or which data shaped all those weights. It's kind of buried in that history.
Yeah,
Whereas in this weightless form, you can see the associations in a lookup table.
yeah, yeah. I can maybe go back to our beginning of the discussion when we talked about the research from the human child thought experiment to animals, as
Mhm.
to add some color to this. If you consider again your dog Fluffy or Puppy, when they're learning a task, they're getting receiving the input like command for sit, so they're hearing sit, and they're gonna do an output. If you had liked that output, you would give them a reward. So
Mhm.
then you can imagine that Puppy now is saving like input, action, I get treats, right?
Mhm.
So and that's the lookup table there that now the puppy is using, that you can kind of relate to. It is baked into the way neural network to the way weightless neural networks can be set up if we're doing this approach. How, like, when you were describing earlier the current paradigm of deep learning, the weights are adjusted, right? With respect to what? The weights are
Error, yeah, basically.
error from what?
The difference between what the output was and what it should have been in some labeled
In
example.
some label, yes. From whose perspective? From outside of the agent. So
Yes.
from outside of the model, right? So the weights in a deep learning model are adjusted with respect to externally provided data. In some sense, that's like, the objective function or the cost function is determined from outside.
Yeah, and
And
then
so,
especially if a person isn't individually labeling every single example and it's going to be automated somehow, then that has to be automated in some kind of process which says in advance what's going to be rewarded, what's going to be, or how much errors there are going to be for any given answer.
right, it implies some other part of the system is missing already, right? So
Yes,
like,
either human evaluator or some
yeah, as
model.
opposed to
Yeah.
when we look at animals, like, let's not talk like just looking at animal intelligence. Puppies self-labeling in some sense. It has an internal objective function that is a function of its past experiences. If I was just to take a step back to the weights in a deep learning system, they're adjusted with respect to something outside of that system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when we look at biological life, the adjustment that happens is with respect to the agent doing the actions. And that has a little bit of the interpretability.
A little bit more on how exactly a weightless neuron or network learns. He kind of talked a little bit about how a weighted artificial neural network work learns, but what kind of shapes the direction of behavior and outputs in a weightless example?
Yeah. I'd have to talk about that with respect to a few examples of applications, right? Talking about it in a general sense, I can do
Sure.
as well as puppy.
You have an example on your website regarding a clam.
Yes.
Actually, feel free to screen share if you like, if there's helpful diagrams in
Cool.
any of
Yeah.
that.
Thank you for that segue. Right before that, just to make the clam more potent, perhaps I want to just think about a puppy that would be fetching a ball because of ball, right? I would suggest that type of puppy you'd probably need to show it a lot of balls. Yeah, you'd always it's like a deep learning net, right? Like a deep learning system. The absurdity of a deep learning system can be like a puppy that's fetching the ball to fetch the ball instead of fetching the ball for treats. Puppies can be complicated. So that's why, like, if you consider evolution right now just as a biologist, like we take off our AI or machine learning hat
Mhm.
and we just take a step out of that bubble and we put on our biologist hats, simple biology, we can see that dogs have this behavior that we would say is intelligent, but then we can look at simpler examples of that in things like a clam. And there's anecdotes and studies of clams that in the wild they close around shadows. Usually they have a light sensing neuron that would close around, that would, through its action, would close around shadows. But then you take clams in captivity in zoos or in labs, and some of them can learn to stay open around shadows. And that's an example of classical conditioning, or whatever you want to call it. Let's not try to put words on it, but I would suggest similar to puppy when you're teaching puppy to sit or not pee on the couch. So why not start at the clam? If we can build that, then we can maybe go up, right? So that's kind of like, yeah, with AO Labs, I've really been trying to start from the bottom up, from an evolutionary perspective. What we have on our website, that's like our hello world. So you can look at clams in the wild, and you can maybe consider them as something as simple as this. It's a creature that's taking in multiple types of input. If you consider a clam as a simpler form of intelligence than a dog, and we're trying to maybe see if we can build something like that, we can consider that a clam would take in multiple types of input. It's a bottom feeder, right? So these inputs are flying over it: the food level and plankton, shadow, temperature, vibration, salinity. And based on that, it's learning when to open and close. As scientists, we want to kind of like break this down in the simplest form so we can go a bit simpler here and just imagine a three input, one output system. Can we have this system learn to associate a particular output with a particular input pattern? Let's say, can we get it to open more to variable A than to variable C, or vice versa? And can we do that just by training it as we would a clam in the wild or a real world clam through something on the input, right? We don't want to have to specifically tell it the input and output to train it. Trying to get away from that. So we have something like food. Can we pair something like food with variable A or variable C and get it to learn? If we can do this, then we can potentially scale up the number of inputs and outputs and the number of reward inputs to get it to learn to associate more complicated things. But for now, like this can be our hello world starting point.
So notice in this example right here, an instinct, it says pleasure triggered in agent. What does pleasure mean in this context?
So if you consider that you have when you're training your dog to fetch a ball or stick or do those things, if they didn't have like the instinct for food that you're playing on when you reward them, you wouldn't have been able to train them. So there is something to that. There is something to your instincts, kind of like triggering some form of learning. And we're trying to capture that here a little bit to get away from having to specify both input and output when we're training it, right? We just want to specify just input. We want to have it learn by itself in some form that we can interpret.
Trying to get the more precisely the difference between this and traditional neurons is like we can kind of see they're similar in the sense of there being inputs coming in, outputs going out, and then some process changing the mappings. But what seems to be different, just looking at this example right here, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is in a traditional network, the reinforcement happens at the very end of the process, like even if there's a bunch of additional steps, and kind of back propagates through, kind of trying to find which neurons were responsible for making the correct choice. Whereas here, it seems to be happening at the, I guess, individual neuron level, and maybe it's happening in like at a bunch of other different places. And so the neurons are kind of seem like they're connected to reality directly, rather than being just like a one piece and the systems being connected to reality. Is that at all
That's on
accurate?
point. The back propagation, you're right. The adjustment to learning happens from the output side, from the very end, and you're back propagating it. You're taking it back to
Mm-hmm.
change all the weights. So that implies that you have to know what the input and output is to train a system.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm saying we can look around us at biological systems like a dog. I don't train my dog with both input and output. It's not the way they work.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to capture that is a little bit of what we're going for here. That's why I have it in the bottom as instinct, kind of
Mm-hmm.
thinking of it as like, either an auto trigger of some sort, like an abstraction above where instead of telling it that this is good, you kind of give it a method to capture its own good,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and then you can trace back the outputs to how that method capture happened, which is the input output state. This agent is going to save a bunch of input output states that are either painful or pleasurable, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
lookup table of this agent. So yeah, the connection to reality, as you were saying, is not because of is because we're just literally saving the states that trigger the instincts, right? And
Mm-hmm.
using those states to drive the learning, which is the observation we can go back to biological life puppy. And we can see this in action. I can maybe now show this in action here.
Sure.
So consider that this oops. Consider this system we're describing. And now we want to try to train it. We can train it with the instincts method that I was describing, or we can just straight up use labels, right? Labels is like telling it to have its mouth be open or close while we
Mm-hmm.
show it a particular input. We can train a system like this. We have this little, workbench here to try to play with it, to grapple with this concept. And we can show this agent any input pattern, like food, chemical A or chemical C. We can show it how we can show this input pattern however many times, and we can see how it responds. I have this clam agent running in the background as kind of described in this diagram. So I'm going to run that and see what happens. And there I'm told I exposed the clam 30 times to all of these inputs, and it didn't open at all, which is unsurprising because this is so far as an untrained clam. I've started them off like that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try training it, right? And now we can train this clam, to say respond to this pattern, food and chemical A, by explicitly telling it to have its output be a certain way for this input. This would be equivalent to deep learning in a sense, in a very basic sense, because we're specifying both the label or the output and the input. But so that's boring. Let's not do that. We can use the instincts thing we were discussing, the instincts method we were discussing, to kind of try to move beyond that. And instincts method here, I've connected it to food, right? So the instinct, like the pleasure instinct, will trigger in the presence of food. So in this state, it won't be learning, but in this state, it should learn, and we can kind of see what happens. So I'm going to show it food and chemical A 30 times with instinct on. If I expose that, I'm told you expose the clam to this input pattern 30 times. and it opened 93% of the time. Okay, so let's see what it learned in this case. Let's see what it learned in this case. I'm gonna keep the instincts on, but I'm gonna remove food, and I'm gonna just not show it any stimulus. Let's see what happens. Okay, so it didn't open at all. Let's see if we add chemical C. Okay, also no response. If we add chemical A, cool, it opens 70% of the time, which is somewhat expected because we did pair that with food. And like let's see how it works with food here. I'm gonna remove instincts just so it's not learning right now, but let's see how it responds to food. So okay, around 56% of the time, yeah, like the same as chemical A, right? Let me just confirm that. Cool, around the same. So what if it's both food and chemical A? What if it's both food and chemical A? Cool, 100% of the time. What if it's chemical A and chemical C? It's almost like chemical C has no effect, which is as we expect. What if we add food? Cool, 100% of the time. Sorry, I don't know if I was going through that too fast, but this is just a thought experiment, right? Like this is a simple system, just 3 inputs and 1 output.
I'd be curious to hear like a narration, like story wise, as to what happened here. My understanding is that while the instincts were on and you were training it, as it were, you taught it to associate food with chemical A. And then food is desirable, or what
Yes,
happens?
yes, it's programmed. It's programmed with a certain number of instincts. And in this system, there's one instinct, which is the food instinct, let's say. So that means that if I had activated instincts here, and the food is present, it'll learn to associate this input state with it should keep its mouth open, right? It should
Mhm.
kind of try to get the food.
Okay, so if food is present, then it should learn to open its mouth. If food is not present, it should learn to close its mouth. And chemical A's and C's are things it associates.
In the beginning, it's programmed to just have its mouth closed,
Right.
right? So yeah, the default is closed in the sense. Um,
Mhm.
and yes, that is the idea. Now, can we get it to respond to chemical A or chemical C or any pattern thereof?
Mm,
And in this case, without having explicitly given it the output, right? We did give it the output through food, but through food, right? So
right.
in a system that's larger than this, we have more inputs, chemical A, chemical B. It's seeing like an array, it's seeing different things. We can have different triggers for instincts that we
Oh,
play on as, you know, um,
I think I'm getting this. So that food is taught as being intrinsically good, and that's kind of like before training as part of this system. And while you're running the instincts and running these trials, you're getting it to associate chemical A and C, things that have no intrinsic value, positive or negative, and you're getting it to respond to those chemicals.
as if they were food, right? It respond the way it
Mm,
responds to food. Yes.
okay.
And we can now connect this to what we were talking earlier about weightless neural networks, because this network, this agent is running on a weightless neural net, right? So we can look inside of its brain, so to say, and we can look at how that input, output, and reward or instinct states are associated.
Oh, would that be something you can do in this app at present to look inside
Yes.
of its brain
So
and like
so
what
here we
the
have the history. Here we have the history tab, and we can look at the story, which is the binary history of all of the activations. This agent is really simple. It's only made up of 3 input neurons and then 3 neurons in the middle, and then 1 neuron for output, and
Mhm.
then 1 neuron to tell us if there was a label, or 1 neuron to tell us if the instinct was triggered. So this is a really simple agent. We can look at that. This is the lookup table, the binary lookup table. And we can also see at like why those neurons are the way they are. You see, this was the initial state, so it's randomly 0 or 1 initially, and then I had trained it to be closed, as I explained.
Mhm.
So this was like a label. Like see here, like it's saying 000. This was a labeled event, and you should have
Mhm.
been 0 when it's all 0. So I had fitted a few labels in the beginning, you see here, but
Mhm.
then later on, when we were running it with instincts, um, you can see here is when the instinct was triggered.
Mhm. I'm seeing the word hamming a lot. What does that mean?
So the agent is again, as it's a weightless neural net. So and it's made up of this number of neurons, three input neurons, three middle layer neurons, one output neuron. The middle and output neurons, to decide how to be 0 or 1, they do a lookup operation on this table, and that lookup operation they do it through Hamming distance, right?
Okay, so trying to see which category of choices is closest.
So each neuron is effectively saying, I'm receiving this input. What does this input look like in my memory? What was I doing at that input? The most similar one, I'll do the same as that. If it's a pleasurable state, right?
Okay.
If it's a painful state, it should just do the opposite. But this system just has pleasure for now, as a simple thought experiment here.
Okay, so when have I seen something similar to this? What was the outcome? If it was good, then I want to do that again. It's kind of
And
the
it's doing that at a neuron level, right? And where is it
right.
getting the idea of good from here in this case? It's getting it from this lookup table, which we have programmed how this lookup table is kind of like inputted through the instincts, right? We've decided on the triggers that'll populate this table. And in some cases, we actually gave it labeled information too. This maybe I can add a little bit more color here, how this agent is configured as a state machine. Because again, if you go back to deep learning, it's just they're trying to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger to map to more of reality. But in this case, we have to design the agent. You consider that this is the architecture of our clam. We have three inputs, and then there's three neurons in the middle, and then there's one output neuron. And these are the ones that are going to save the painful or pleasurable states to learn to look up from those states.
One thing that this brings up, just kind of looking at that, is it's seeming to me like maybe this is a good thing that you're bringing in a lot of as the engineer a lot of knowledge into this clam is in saying like how does it respond to these sort of things. I'm kind of wondering like how this what this looks like as it scales, because like with the traditional neurons it seems to scale well. This is a little glib, but kind of by magic, you just make it bigger and it can handle more things, and who knows how. Whereas, like, I'm wondering if you had something more complex than a clam, would you need to like hand write a lot more, like what it pays attention to for each neuron, all the way through it? Is that not a problem? What does this look like as it gets bigger?
Yes, yes. Those have been the type of questions that we've been involved in as researchers, as research developers, right? Like we know that there's an hopefully a need for something like this. We have, that's the alignment thing that we're trying to contribute to. We have an approach that's informed by a technique, but we now we're understanding the limits and all of that. This is where we still have to be a little bit outside of the AI world in a sense and look at biology. As complicated as this is, it does seem like a way to get some interpretability that
Mhm.
maps to what we know from animals. And then we can maybe just use evolution as a guide, right? So the clam is like the simplest experiment of this. But AI researchers and neuroscientists have been looking at another organism called C. elegans, which is a worm, a small little like microscopic worm that they do experiments on petri dishes. It has exactly 303 neurons in its brain. And we still don't really know how it works. Maybe we've been looking at it the wrong way in a sense. But that worm can do the same behavior as the clam, same behavior as a dog. You put it on a petri dish with food and the chemical, it'll associate such that you put it on another petri dish, it'll go to that chemical that it associated with food as opposed to anything else in the
Mhm.
environment. And it forgets this it forgets this in 7 days and all of that stuff, right? And we can we're in our I don't have we don't have this on our website yet, but this is what we're working on as our active research project is a worm level intelligence that can do that, and that's a scale up from this clam system.
Mhm.
That should be useful in certain applications. As engineers now, back to engineering land, we've been working on a few applications too, right? So we've been applying this type of agent AI to certain applications. I can show you another demo There's another one where a clam level agent, an agent at the level of this clam demo that we saw, slightly scaled up in one direction, is helping device discovery in networks. So like when a new device is added to a network, what role is this device? We can predict that role from a list of local devices.
Just in terms of like at present or near term scale, just like with basic engineering, not major new insights, what kind of tasks is this type of network that you're creating exceptionally well suited for? And also, what kind of tasks is it hard to see how it would apply? What are its strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, it's we're still really figuring that out in terms of getting that level of resolution. There, from the literature that's been done in the 80s on this technique, they've scaled it up to thousands of numbers of neurons, right? So the scaling number-wise is not an issue. It's
Mhm.
more just like how do you, in our approach, because they had this technique before and they scaled it up, but in our approach, given how we have this way to build instinct in, how do we scale up to a useful agent? That's still an open question.
Looked into this a little bit, and I saw the term Wizard come up a lot, WISARD,
Right.
and like ramnets. So
Yes.
there has been work in this direction, not beyond just your lab, as far as I'm know
So
of.
Wizard was yeah, Wizard was one of the first, actually one of the first ever object detection algorithms that reached commercial success. And it was developed by Igor Alexander, the guy who invented weightless neural networks at Imperial College. And
Mhm.
yeah, that was an example that was only applied to object detection systems, right? So it's like input and output, but like input and label, right? Image and label.
Mhm.
But they got it to work in a certain in a good way. It was one of the first commercial systems. We're trying to do something here where we're looking at the current status quo, looking at alignment, and seeing that wow, even at the root level, we have to tell AI what input and output is to train it. So there always has to be somebody to do that for it.
Mhm.
What if the end user can do that? What if you can do that yourself?
Okay, so in the past, with some previous work on weightless neural networks, they've had some effective applications in classification. I imagine they'd probably be good at something like MNIST with the
Yeah,
character
yeah. So
recognition.
we also applied, when we were starting on research, that was the first thing we did as well as conscientious researchers, as applied our implementation. Like, so we implemented weightless neural networks in Python, right? We have it running. That's our website.
Mhm.
We benchmarked that against MNIST. In that
Okay.
case, we had like 28 by 28 times two number of neurons, and we trained it on thousands of it works. That goes back to the high level of the beginning of the conversation. Consider MNIST, right? It's images and label, image and label, image and label. No matter how good an agent or an algorithm or a model gets at learning that mapping, you would never say it understands what a number is, right? A number is not the meaning of a number is not just in the visual representation of a number. We benchmarked against MNIST, but that was only actually to get a sense of the size and scale.
Mhm.
It doesn't actually like that's why we went to the clam as a more basic example, because the clam would understand what chemical A is, associating that with food, and we can look at the lookup table and see, oh yeah, yeah, it's from these states that it responded that way to chemical A.
So given that like yeah, it's been established in the past, and you've managed to recreate the object classification through this weightless this pattern, and you're trying to move in new directions. What sort of things you're trying to achieve by using this clam example? Like, what are some applications you could see development going well nearish future that could be useful? You mentioned the device detection a little bit already. Like,
Yeah, those are other applications. You look at from the conversations that we've had with developers already. Like that's why we have our website up to try to talk to people,
mhm.
because it's all relative to applications, right? From those conversations, the network device discovery one has come up. We talked to Disney Plus briefly about a per user recommendation system, right? Usually recommender systems are pre-trained.
Mhm.
Pre-trained on what? Pre-trained on many people's views.
Mhm.
So it's kind of comparing you to many people. One model is comparing you to many people. That's why you get filter bubble effects and everything else, right?
Mhm.
So we can instead maybe build a smaller agent that's you're rewarding food whenever it gives you content that you like.
Mhm.
It would have been something you trained that I'm teaching it to fetch content for me, right?
So you have your website up, and you're actually calling for participation, or people to come to you with
I'll go
something
to
that you
them.
could.
I'll go to them too.
Yeah, or go to. So describe what your ideal client application looks like at this point. Like, who
Sure.
would, if someone messaged you and said, "This is the thing I want to work on," where you would say, "Yes, this is a perfect place. You came to the right place. I want to, I want to work on this."
Yeah, yeah, it's situations where it's all like a subjective application, like recommendation systems. Like, what's a good recommendation system? It's really like it should be good if it's good for you. That level of application, that's awesome for us. In terms of more business stuff, it's like businesses that have low tolerance for false positives. So maybe instead of having a system that's pre-trained and fixed in pre-training, you can retrain our layer, right? So it can get better at your false positives at not identifying that. Those are a few other like applications we've like high level. Those have been the main threads. You look at even IoT devices. Like IoT devices, usually they're great. They're better than the past control systems. But that smarts is still based off of everyone's usage patterns, right? It's one
Mhm.
big model that's pre-trained in most instances. What if you can just train your own AI agent at home to learn when to open your lights for you?
So we've mentioned a little bit about interpretability, and we can kind of see there in that table where you can see like where it's getting its decision making is coming from. Be curious about like other sort of benefits of taking this approach. You started talking a little bit about personalization. I'd say a bit more about that.
Yeah, yeah, I want to talk about that for sure, and I just want to segue another, like mention another point real quick that it's not really a replacement that I don't think is necessary. It's more like just filling in the gaps, right? So one of those other gaps with personalization can be known as the hallucination problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're on your
Yeah.
computer, you're talking to GPT or whatever, and then all of a sudden it doesn't make sense, or make stuff up for you, or if it maybe it'll even say something that you would say is biased, right? It's hallucinated something or said something that doesn't fit your reality, so it's biased.
So your system, you say, is less prone to hallucination.
So what is AI hallucination, right? It's like if you look at Wikipedia, it's been there only for the last 6 months on Wikipedia, AI
Mm-hmm.
hallucination. But really, driverless cars. We thought we'd have driverless cars already, but they still get messed up with stop signs that have graffiti on them. They like hallucinate that that's not a stop sign, right? So the hallucination problem is really just part of deep learning. It's not a new problem. It's just there's going to be sometimes there's going to be outputs that are sometimes there's going to be inputs that are out of distribution that give you out of distribution outputs,
Actually,
right?
I should back up for a moment for the audience here. Actually, describe in your view like what hallucination is in traditional networks, and what do you think causes it?
And hallucination is just when it gives you an answer that you don't agree with, right? It doesn't think it hallucinated, but that's what we. I mean,
Actually, I think I'll give an example of it. I forget the details of some of this, but someone had asked ChatGPT and blogged about this to write about this particular like mentioned a name and said like, do you recognize who this person is? ChatGPT correctly answered that they were a professor of a certain discipline, but I think it was biology at some college. And then the person asked, tell me a little bit more about them. And then ChatGPT made up this story about there being sexual harassment allegations against
wow.
them, and then also even included a citation, in proper citation form. Now it went to a 404 not found page because it was there were no such allegations like ever made against this person, and the citation was completely bogus. But
Yeah.
basically, like it just completely made that up. And you can kind of explain it in terms of like, well, it's trying to predict the next token. And for some reason, it thought that was a plausible story that made a good answer. And isn't really trying to be truthful, or just isn't for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, I can add some color to that maybe from my research here because it's all relative again. You look at the sense of truth that puppy has when they're doing their thing. It's the hallucination problem is it's just been here for a while, right? So like the story, the anecdote you shared, the model was giving you those outputs that made up that nonsense, right? That was just like an equation that has been trained a certain way to give you certain outputs. That's end of story. Like there's so is that a hallucination? Can truth be found in an equation like that? Like, what does that even mean, right? Like, it's like something is missing in the look and the approach to that. Because what does that imply? Does that imply, like, who's gonna align the AI with which reality so we can say it's not hallucinating? That's really the question at some point. I feel like that's very convoluted, but in the models that we looked at, sorry, in the agent that we looked at, like the clam agent, the output is forever constrained in that lookup table, right? The output is only ever going to be an amalgamation of whatever is in the lookup table.
Maybe this is being a little too abstract here, but I'm kind of imagining like looking at the future versus the past in a way. Like the traditional neurons, it generates some kind of equation to explain how inputs map to outputs, and when you get to something unfamiliar, it's like looking at this equation like, well, okay, what does this project outwards in terms of like, where do I go with this from this pattern? Whereas in the weightless model, it's kind of looking more backwards of what is the experience that I've had already that this is closest to, and
Yes,
saying
yes, very
that.
astute. Yes, and that goes back hand in hand also with like the gap between training and inference. Pre-trained systems like GPT, the P is pre-trained by design because there has to be a gap where you kind of like pause it because you know the future and you're going to adjust the weights based on that,
Mm-hmm,
right? And then you apply it. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
so it's yeah, spot on. That was a great way of saying it, Will. That was spot on. It's a complicated problem, Like, look, there's a lot of excitement about AI, and maybe people kind of are pigeonholed in one technique now, right? We've been looking at it for so long that we've maybe lost some other ideas that can be out there. When I look at alignment in that way, kind of makes me feel a bit better because it's not gonna be this thing that like see the alignment problem is interesting to have. I should have maybe asked you this in the beginning, because some people are scared about alignment now, or alignment now and whatever, and some people are not worried about alignment until it's like super intelligent, and then
Mm-hmm,
they're worried about alignment,
mm-hmm.
right? And I mean, I can comment on that. I have a lot of opinions on that from based on the experience I have, which is maybe a direction you want to take this in. But yeah, this is interesting. Well,
Speak a little bit to, so we've mentioned some of the advantages. I'd like to move a little bit towards the alignment question. I guess I'll just start with what your understanding of alignment is, and just kind of like what matters and what doesn't, like in terms of present decision making and research directions.
AI alignment is something I'm interested in a lot. I don't know too much about the current space really as it's being done, because I think a lot of it has been drawn to the super intelligent AI alignment field. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I completely ignore that myself, and I can explain why. But maybe that's why I don't want to speak for the community. Like, I don't know too much about the way it's really. I can
My
I
what I'm getting at is like where you kind of see yourself as fitting into the larger picture.
I don't know. I can't comment on that too much. That's what I'm saying. Maybe I don't have enough of the bigger picture to place myself in it.
Okay.
I can say that when I look at alignment, I'm always going to ask, like, alignment with respect to who, right? It's like
Mm-hmm.
somebody needs to who's going to align my AI for me. That's the perspective I'm looking at it. Like, sure, it can be aligned, but who aligned it for me? Because I need to be aligned with that. Like, is that aligned?
So this gets to that personalization topic that we're started to go into a little bit, and so I guess an example of that is like with Chat GPT, for example, there are a lot of like values being kind of pushed into it from through the reinforcement learning from human feedback process of it, in terms of like what kind of answers it can give, what it should say, and what it shouldn't, and for whatever positives and negatives you could say about it, ultimately that's OpenAI's perspective, and maybe that's different from what a lot of its users are, because people are different,
Right.
and you're kind of looking for ways that people can personalize what their AI gives them a little bit more.
Right. Like, I want the AI to reflect my reality, right? I want the AI to be aligned with me. So I should be able to align my own AI in some sense, have a mechanism to. This is interesting. There's maybe I have to go back to the biology of it a little bit here. When I look at my pet dogs and animals, there is an alignment. We can have that, right? That's something to at least it says that something is missing in our conception of AI if we can't get to that level, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
we've missed. So if something is missing from our conception of AI, I mean, that's why I also like challenge the super intelligent alignment folks. Yeah, that's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of space for, debate and disagreement in terms of like what we expect to happen in the long term, because, long term is necessarily speculative being in the
Sure.
future. But I think one thing that pretty much anyone who cares about alignment at all can probably agree on is that if short term things are doing things that we don't want, not because of capabilities, but because they're actually kind of optimizing in a direction that we don't want in ways that are observable right now, that's not good, both for the near term and as implications for longer on,
Fair.
regardless of what you
That's
think
very
is going to
fair. That's
happen
very fair. That's
long.
very fair.
So your focus is kind of more on like things right now, getting them to work in ways that we want on that kind of present existing sort of level.
It's in my mind it adds up to the larger level as well. I'm not sure how to really explain that or if it's relevant, like you're saying. Perhaps it's
Mhm,
not. That look on alignment, I think, is we're already seeing present dangers as well from
mhm,
lack of that, right?
mhm.
So addressing those present dangers is something I think that's more relevant than future speculation. That's necessarily speculation.
I've mentioned one, area that's heavily debated is like what do we expect to happen in the future. Another thing that's also very uncertain is whether aligning things right now is like this is the foundation that we need for the future, or whether future problems are just totally different and it is just different things. Again, there isn't really a consensus there. So I think regardless of where people stand, fixing things that are problems and real and present dangers right now, I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that helping with that is good.
Sure. With regard, you kind of brought up an interesting point here. So I'm gonna try to say something. I'm not sure if it'll come out really well, but you were bringing up this interesting point about like, is alignment something that needs to happen now so we can get it, like it can kind of grow on top of that and whatever.
Mhm,
Um, this is a little bit of like the bottom up versus top down way of looking at things, maybe.
mhm,
Um, at AO Labs, we're trying to build smaller AI that we can build more complicated shapes going up. But then, there's already AI that works really well because we've been able to specify the objective or the output for it, and it works really well. It's kind of like unaligned with anything. It's like a question of, is the data good or all that. There's an analogy here that's maybe helpful to add some color, which I'm not sure I'll be able to explain it very well, but I'll try. You consider, like we talked about human baby as the thought
mhm,
experiment, and then we talked about dogs and clans and worms in between, maybe. Consider another creature like owls, right? And owls, they have the best eyes for their environment. They can spot mice thousands of yards away. I'd suggest that owl eye is like a convolutional neural net, like a deep learning net, except
mhm,
instead of being trained on thousands of labeled photos of like mice and photo,
mhm,
it's trained on thousands of years of successful owl of action at that task to have the right retinal neural connections, right?
mhm,
But of course, if you were to take the eye, like pop the eye out of the owl, and
mhm.
you need to point it somewhere, it can maybe identify, but there's no real way to say it recognize something. That's the situation we're in now a little bit. We've kind of built all of these smart parts. Maybe we've cheated evolution by having all the data, but they kind of like are floating around, and it's a question of where people point them that's scarier than themselves. But then the owl eye is connected to the rest of the owl body, and is that whole owl body that you can then like pair yellow with mice meat, and then you can get an owl that can identify yellow, and you can trust its understanding of yellow, and it can be aligned with your understanding of yellow,
Mhm.
right? Like you see, so that's so then it's like okay, we can build more and more of the, like get more complicated and everything, but where does this all alignment is self alignment, and at some point the AI needs to have that too for us to be able to relate to it. I don't know. I'm not sure how else to say this right
I
now.
haven't heard that phrase. All alignment is self alignment. What is that drawing from?
I mean, that's just how I think about it in terms of alignment, right? And you look at the interpretability we were talking about with the
Mhm,
clam. It's the like the dog is always aligned with themselves, right? They're never
mhm,
gonna um like. Sorry, let me take a step back. if I were to give you a dog that you don't know how it's been trained. You don't know its history of association with reward and with pain.
Hmm.
So you don't know if it's going to pee on your couch or sit when you say sit, but you can still understand its instincts, right?
Mm.
It's not a lot. It's not going to be misaligned with that. Yeah, so maybe that's how I think about it. I don't know. That just occurred to me. Like all alignment is self alignment, really.
Imagining this approach you're working with at AO Labs, imagining it's scaling up and you're have all the success that you want in terms of like building these things out. Do you see this as something that could eventually, like in theory, replaces machine learning, is used just on specific tasks, and it kind of competes in terms of like there are different things that are good at, or that it like maybe inserts itself at some step in a larger process? Like where do you imagine this approach fitting in?
Strictly on top as another layer, right? Not really a replacement. We already have all this stuff working. It's just not working in a complete, like there's something missing, right? So I'm not suggesting that we have all of it, but looking at the owl analogy that I just shared,
Mm-hmm.
the eye was built kind of top down through evolution.
Mm-hmm.
The owl organism is something else, right? That uses that eye for its purposes. How this fits in is like a layer that can be locally trained on top of whatever other stuff is already out there to
Mm-hmm.
put that stuff in a local context. You get this output from a LLM or a other deep learning system that's a
Mm-hmm.
pre-trained system, but that output needs to be put in a certain context to know whether or not to accept it and move on or not. So I think that's a different layer. I don't think it can be in the GPT, in the pre-trained layer, right? All right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it with AO Labs. I want to see how this works, how this actually maps in reality, right? So that's like, if you consider the human again, like a human um,
Mm-hmm.
being, our eyes are amazing, really, kind of like owl eyes, but they're connected to the rest of our body, right? So yeah, we're trying to build that other bottom up component that can connect with that.
So
I
it
don't feel
kind of
like this is being super clear, but
So it kind of, I'll try to summarize, and then you can tell me whether I'm off base or not. I kind of get the sense that this weightless approach seems to work better, like when at a little bit higher level, in a way where you're like not dealing with so many different inputs and different interactions. Kind of like using that owl example, maybe you would use traditional machine learning for like the eyes and like recognizing objects, and then this weightless approach with, okay, now I have these objects, how do they relate to each other in terms of like what actions I actually want to take?
right, and that would be the locally trained system. Those are already pre-trained, are already done, right? Yeah, yeah, yes, yes. I mean, obviously, we're not at the level of an owl yet, right? But I don't even right now at our level. We've been building our applications in isolation. We're not really using too much of the regular machine learning stuff. But that's where that analogy comes from.
Mhm.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah, and I can also imagine that as being like where it would be the most useful in terms, like even in terms of like alignment sort of questions. So like if a if an artificial intelligence like doesn't really correctly recognize an eye, like that doesn't seem like the most high impact sort of thing, from an image. But then like it's the higher level planning and decision making where I'm kind of be more concerned about being able to see inside it and what it does. And it's like the higher level choices is where interpretability and reliability is needed most, more than just like, how do these pixels relate to each other? Or how do all these words relate to each other? And
Yeah,
so I can, and also in terms of what's difficult and easy, like I mentioned that challenge when looking at that clam example, like, oh yeah, if you, this choice, I get it, but like if you made like millions of these choices and you're having to engineer all of them, that seems really hard. Maybe like narrowing that down, it could play to its strengths.
right. That's why we're starting with simpler, smaller networks anyway. We can't just put a bunch
Mhm.
of stuff and hope it works, right?
Right.
Um, but yeah, yeah, the owl analogy is helpful in this context. That's what I'm saying. It's not really a replacement that we're looking for. It's just let's try
Mhm.
to fill in the gaps. Let's try to make some systems that we can train ourselves more directly in this way. Then that's how we can like have AI where we can relate to its output, we can relate to its understanding. If I'm exploding this in the alignment direction, for me, I think of like one of the shows I used to watch as a kid is like the Jetsons,
Mhm.
and there was Rosie of the Jetsons, the robot washing their taking care of their home,
Mhm.
and I shudder to think of like a Rosie in my home that's pre-trained by somebody else taking care of my kids and folding my dishes, cleaning my dishes, right?
Right.
Who's going to pre-train it for me? Am I going to trust their views with respect to how they've trained my AI? At that
I,
level of absurdity, it doesn't make sense to
I mean,
me.
especially if it extrapolates out from, data it has to novel situations and like comes up with a creative solution based on a pattern it's seen, and like you don't even know like it might things that even the trainers wouldn't have liked.
Yeah, it's absurd. Like that level of absurdity to me makes the alignment thing clear, right? It's like that needs to be something I can train myself because that's the only way I can trust it, right? Like I can
Mhm.
trust my dog, I can trust what they are, I can trust their understanding. I need to be able to trust that 600 pound like robot's understanding.
Yeah, and because it's looking at like the past and like what are some things that have happened before that this is closest to that I can categorize towards, you can kind of see that like even if it messes up, it's going to be in a way that's a little more predictable and less extreme
And hopefully something
than
you can retrain, right? Like
yeah.
like the robot at home, it can be like you can program in some commands as the food, right? So
Mhm.
whenever I say good boy, for instance, that can be something that triggers its pleasure instinct, so it then saves whatever it was doing that input output.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's an engineering question. I think we're at the level of engineering questions, right? But that's what we're trying to do at AO Labs. But that's how I think it can fit in, right? It's not a replacement. It doesn't make sense to. It's just there's been a few researchers who are looking at things outside of the deep learning paradigm as well.
Mhm.
So it's been nice not to be as lonely as before. Yeah, I mean, seriously, when I think about this, like I just didn't get on that deep learning train back in 2011, 2012, right? I could have so easily got on it. It's not like even it
Mhm.
just went off in a different direction a little bit.
Imagining that I think sounds a lot more sane and hopeful, kind of imagining like that sort of model of how AI works. I imagine, someone who is a little bit more pessimistic might, find flaws, digging into it deeply, imagined flaws, perhaps
I
that are
welcome all of
arguable.
that. That would be really awesome. That would be
Um,
really awesome.
but like honestly, that at least that sounds like a big step in the right direction. So I guess that leads me to my last set of questions here is if someone sees this or looks at your website and wants to learn more, where would you direct them?
Wants to learn more, join us. Like, let's talk, right? Because it's not just like learning more. Like we have stuff on the website, but we got
Mhm.
to start building more stuff. Especially that, given how all of this is relative to the agent and all of that, it's not something
Mhm.
you can just abstract. Yeah, I welcome all interest. Anybody who is even very critical, that would be awesome. Actually, we have a way to kind of chat with us on our website, Discord, and all of that good stuff.
And if
Um,
someone wanted to get involved, like what might that look like?
Yeah, we've already had contributors to our code, thank God. So I implemented the stuff from the 80s in Python with a few contributors, and we've tested it out against MNIST, and then we've built the reference applications or reference designs you see on our demo page, the clan
Mhm.
being the easiest one, the network device discovery one also is there, MNIST is there as code. We're trying to build and in turn and like we're just building more reference designs, right
Mhm.
now. We have a different number of projects going on in that direction. I'm building a Minecraft bot, for instance, that the user would be training in the game by saying good boy or bad boy to
Mhm.
kind of get training it in the game, kind of taking on Voyager, which was a pre-trained Minecraft bot.
Mhm.
I don't think we'll be as smart as them, but ours will be trained in this different way that could have just as a reference design. So that's what we're up to. We're looking for our first few applications. We already have a few others. We have a few other projects like a recommendation system that we're working on. There's an e-commerce plugin like predicting the right product. There's other ideas that actually I need help with. Contributors at all levels. Yeah, really. And we're working on this as a research venture. Like the way the startup world has gone, people are not really doing research at the same time. But I don't see another way for something like this. So it is also a startup, right? So I'm like collaborated at all levels, really. I've been in the weeds as a researcher and looking to kind of like expand